Mm-hmm.
Welcome everyone to our very first JSSS online event. My name is Evie Wolfa, and I am the current president of the Jungian Society for Scholarly Studies. JSS Online is a series of talks and discussions that is offered by Jungian Society for Scholarly Studies by JSS members. What do we do? JSSS provides opportunities to share knowledge in arts and culture and sciences, and also clinical experiences, all through transdisciplinary perspectives and methodologies. The Society's support for diverse ways of knowing the psyche guides the design of this JSS online events, this series, and also our conferences and our journal. And talking about conferences, I would like that all of you know, and I invite you to attend our annual conference this year. It's going to be in Asheville, North Carolina. It's from July 27th to July 30th. All our events and also journal, you can find them on our website, and the name of the website is jungiansociety.org, jungiansociety.org. During the event, as I mentioned, this event is recorded, and we will record the talk part, and once we get to questions and answers, we'll turn the recording off. If you have any questions during the Q&A time, please raise your hand, and then you'll get a chance to ask the question. If you would like to type your question, please use the chat area. You can also use it during the entire talk. And also, I would like to ask that if during the talk, and also if you're not talking, please put yourself on mute, because that would help us with the echo issues, that we don't have any echo. So today is our first JSS online event, and our very first speaker is Dr. Susan Rowland. I know I don't really need to introduce Susan, but I do want to say that Susan is my very, very favorite author and teacher and speaker, and I welcome you, Susan, and I would like to hand over to you now.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Evie, and for all the work that you're doing and for putting on this event. So most of you know that I've worked for a long time in the Jungian area with an emphasis on gender, feminism, and the arts. And what this talk is going to focus on is my new long-term project. And I know that some of you may be joining us today because you want to know more about Jungian arts-based research. This is a methodology which is implicitly transdisciplinary, and it's only recently been articulated. Although what happens in Jungian arts-based research has been done a lot by artists and researchers in that area. And of course, in one way, Jungian arts-based research draws on the history of alchemy. So after sort of articulating Jungian arts-based research in a book which is of that name, I begin my project, which is to continue exploring the marginalized feminine, but in a different form, in an art-making form, because Jungian arts-based research is an addition to the existing arts-based research that has been going on in the social sciences for about 30 years, but most of it without any sense of psychology and without any sense of the possible contribution to arts-based research from a Jungian perspective. So I'm going to say a few things quite quickly about Jungian arts-based research, and then I'm going to get on to the recent work on this, which has been done through mystery novels. So quickly, let me say that as part of my long-term project is to explore the marginalized feminine in the 21st century through three figures who make up mythically the maiden, the matron, and the crone, otherwise known as the triple goddess. But these are forms of feminine marginalization. So the crone is the sort of leading character. Her name is Mary Wandwalker. I'm hoping somebody will ask me about her surname. And she's in the margins because she made a terrible mistake earlier in her life and kind of forgot to have a life and has ended up alone and without any kind of family. And the matron is the depressed woman. I wanted to explore the marginalization that comes with a chronic mental illness. And it so happens that chronic clinical depression is something I know a great deal about. And my maiden is Anna, who is in her early 20s. And she is a maiden not because she's never had sex, but because she was trafficked as a child. And this is something I don't know a great deal about, but it is something that is I've felt for a long time is extremely important, that the trafficked woman is someone in our time that we should be addressing. And Jungian methods of imagination, I think, are important here. But let me say a few more things about Jungian arts-based research first. So I do have some slides. Now, the good thing about this talk being recorded is if I'm going a bit fast, you know that you will have access to this material again. I'm also not great at PowerPoint, but here we are. So this talk is actually called Jungian Arts-Based Research, Alchemy, America, and the Climate Emergency, which is what's been worked on in this new novel, The Alchemy Fire Murder, that was published a couple of weeks ago. Now, you can probably see a strange looking guy who does not look contemporary. And you're right. This is the historical John Winthrop Jr. And in the 17th century, he became one of the early colonial governors of Connecticut. What's less known about him is that he was a practicing alchemist. Now, if we think about C.G. Jung, we know that he was into alchemy. We know that he read books by the 17th century alchemists, including Elias Ashmole. Winthrop knew Ashmole. Winthrop was part of that gang of alchemists in London, but also extending through Europe. So we have really here somebody that Jung could have read about in his research. And Winthrop wanted to make the colony into an alchemy colony. He had big plans. Mostly they didn't work out, but the idea of having alchemy in the early colonial period is extremely interesting when we think about that period and what was going on. So I will come back to that. So quickly about Jungian arts-based research. It is not art psychotherapy, which is a different thing and, an established practice that you can take courses in. It is not art done as a result of therapy. It is not necessarily anything to do with therapy. And it's not art done to illustrate Jungian ideas. It is research, but it's not anti-intellectual, but it decenters intellect in research. It is research in the sense of making knowledge through disciplinary means. This is real research that goes into it can go into real academic journals and can go to real academic conferences. It is part of the existing arts-based research in the social sciences, where it constitutes a new paradigm alongside and separate from classical science or the social science paradigm of qualitative research. And crucially, Jungian arts-based research is taking the unconscious, bodily, non-rational, creative knowing into knowledge making. So, how can Jungian ideas and Jungians contribute to multiple topics and modes of research, from autoethnography to weapons of mass destruction, from tackling cultural complexes to giving the marginalized a voice? JABR can be critical activist. It can be done with groups. It requires no art training. It can be done in any creative practice. For art is a kind of alchemical magic, participating in the changing of the world. And for the therapists, Jungian arts-based research is doing therapy with the world. It takes Jungian work out of the clinician's room and into active engagement with the world. So, my shorthand for covering everything, something I've come up with relatively recently, is the 4 Ps. And here they are: paradigm, preparation, process, and projectio. This covers why it's important, how to do it, and how to make meaning. And I will briefly speak to these. The making meaning, I'm drawing on ideas by Rowland Jr., who wrote a very useful book, Arts-Based Research Primer. He divides arts-based research into analytic, or thinking in materials, synthetic, or synthesizing discourses, critical activist, making a difference while doing it, and improvisatory, something the Jungians know a lot about. My suggestion is that we use these categories as ways of making meaning in our art. So we're talking about including in our creative work Jung's 4 psychic functions: thinking and judging, feeling and valuing, sensation, including aesthetic appreciation, and intuition. We can also bring in James Hillman's 4 pillars, which link interestingly to artistic genres: personifying, pathologizing, psychologizing, dehumanizing. People are welcome to ask me about any of these, and if stuff occurs to you while we're talking, feel free to type it into the chat. So quickly, the paradigm. We know about the paradigm of science. And science is a paradigm of repeatable experiments where the person and psyche of the researcher must not intervene in the experiment. And for that, the paradigm basically comes down to a complete subject-object split, that we are innately separate and cut off from the world and cut off from each other. And the paradigm of the scientific method has achieved many things. Unfortunately, it has become hegemonic. It has influenced our culture so much that splitting has become, has happened to an extreme and is now really very much part of our 21st century crises. And arguably, depth psychology and Jung's work arises as an attempt to address splitting in the psyche, but as Jung came to realize, the splits were not wholly internal, and that the world was split because of this the way in which Western modernity had built itself around the subject-object split. Now, the paradigm of qualitative research arose in the social sciences to look at things that can't really be researched by the researcher pretending to be a machine. And it very much includes the psyche and the person of the researcher, tends to emphasize the conscious methods, but has included the unconscious. Now, this is not the entire paradigm of arts-based research. The paradigm of arts-based research is not simply qualitative, because what you end up with is a piece of art. And perhaps the definition of art here is a materialization of psychic energy that can be viewed by other people. It can go into the world, and the meaning of the artwork is not owned by the artist. The material object is open to potentially limitless reinterpretation by audiences across time and space. And of course, it is not a subject-object split paradigm. And this fits incredibly well with transdisciplinarity, which we probably don't have time to talk about today, but you never know. So why am I writing murder mysteries? Well, for one thing, I'm writing murder mysteries because the figure of the fictional detective has been a way of exploring gender over the past 2 centuries, and there's wonderful examples of this. There has been very few examples of detectives with chronic depression, and the way in which trafficking has been dealt with has been mainly about the detective as a hero rescuing people, not actually focusing on the heroism of someone who has got out of that world. The other thing that makes the genre important to me, and genre might be a way into Jungian arts-based research, is that within the genre we see elements of the Holy Grail. And the Holy Grail story, we see elements of the ancient story of the rape of the Well Maidens. And in the Holy Grail and the rape of the Well Maidens, which is about a patriarchal king and knights raping the Well Maidens who protect the waters that link our world to the other world. In both of these myths, we see the climate emergency. They are ways of exploring our psychic reaction to the climate emergency. So these are the elements with which I begin my arts-based research. My preparation is about getting into the right psychic place for starting the art as research in a Jungian psychically dynamic frame. So far, there have been 2 novels have resulted from this, and there will be more. And I'm also using elements here. So the Sacred Well Murders was about water, and I wanted to explore the connection to the indigenous of people of European descent, or Europeans, basically people like me. We care about wanting to connect to indigenous peoples, but perhaps we need to look at our own indigenous roots. And also there was a great deal about trauma there. This book turns out to be about alchemy, America, including the climate emergency, wildfires, racism, and white supremacists. Evie, how am I doing for time? I can't actually see the time here.
We are 20 minutes after the hour.
Okay, so I won't go for much longer, but I wanted to show this image. What you see here is a picture of the Thomas wildfire in Southern California. And you'll notice, and on a particular day, which happens to be Christmas Day 2017, and you'll notice that it surrounds an area that is unburnt. Well, I live in that area which is unburnt, and in fact I live very close to a burning area just above the lake. And in December 2017, my house almost burnt down in this wildfire, which was the worst that had ever been at that time. And this was not a good time for me. And yet, on this day that this image was taken, was the day I began the Alchemy Fire Murder. So included in this story is a look at white privilege and the whole kind of history of Africans and America. I'm going to move on. I'm going to move on. So here is how the elements, the historical elements, went into the story. So there was the discovery of the alchemist, John Winthrop Jr. in the history of America. There was in 2017, as unfortunately there is today, a whole issue of racism and white supremacy. There was the wildfire. And then for a long time, I've been interested in Julian of Norwich, who was a medieval theologian and an anchorite. And I wanted, Oxford University is often part of my stories, and I wanted to feminize Oxford. I wanted fictionally to put a feminine element in the history of Oxford, which of course was for centuries educating only men and on behalf of a male church. So I made Julian a co-founder of an Oxford college. The actual historical St. Edmund's Hall became St. Julian's, and that comes in as part of the story. Also, there's a scroll, the alchemy scroll in the story started at St. Julian's and ends up in America because my alchemist stole it. So my alchemist is Francis Andrew Ransome, who goes to America with Robert Moor, and Robert Moor turns out to be Robert the Moor, an African alchemist. They come across, in the 21st century, the scroll is desperately needed by the Oxford College. So my lead character, Mary Wandwalker, is sent to retrieve it from a Los Angeles museum. Interestingly, the Ripley scroll is in the Huntington Library. There is a blizzard and a wildfire. And when Mary goes to 21st century California. Now the wildfire is historic, and the blizzard wasn't until a couple of days ago when there was a blizzard warning for Los Angeles. So, and that's a very kind of unexciting example of what happens when you do Jungian art-based research. Stuff comes up that later proves to be prescient. So I made up the European History Foundation as a white supremacist trying to take over part of the academy, and then I discovered that actually this was actually happening. So here we have just some thoughts about alchemy and the climate emergency, that alchemy is a way of engaging with nature which is reciprocal and which basically includes the notion that everything is connected to everything else. Now, ecology also is the notion that everything is connected to everything else. Both alchemy and ecology are thinking about that differently, but they have the same principles. And what is interesting about John Winthrop Jr. is that he brought the idea of alchemy and the anima mundi to America, where there was already an indigenous spirituality that was not entirely different. So the tribes that some of whom he met, their spirituality included the notion of the Great Spirit, which is not entirely different to the anima mundi. And what we see here is how it could have been different. It could have been different if the early colony had truly taken on the idea of alchemy and started to relate the land and the peoples differently. So, a last point about the novel, and that is narrative. Back. So Jung names 12 alchemy processes. And what I realized was that these are forms of narrative, as well as forms of processes. So the story is divided into these 12 alchemical processes. The novel aims to be alchemy as well as to address the subject of alchemy. The unique possibilities of Jungian art-based research include moments of synchronicity and active imagination. And I commend the 4 Ps to you. I'm going to stop sharing here because I think it's important that we have time to discuss some of this. But here we have my project so far, the study of marginalized women from their point of view through the murder mysteries, including possession and individuation, the European indigenous, personal myth and cultural myth very much come to the fore in the Alchemy Fire Murder. And one of the things that wanted to come up, and that's the question I ask students when we're talking about active imagination, what wants to come up? And that's the good question for the preparation of Jungian arts-based research. What wanted to come up was to reimagine an African in the early history of America, and that becomes an important part of the story. American alchemy, what might have been? Okay, I think we will stop this there.